Diksha, who's been doing this for the last 11 years, have explained who everybody is, so I don't need to kind of repeat it. Now, I am going to take this beyond what you've written, okay? Both of you. You know, today's socio-political situation, there is this, I mean, it's become a battleground between mythology and history. Now, I see mythology as something like a moral manifesto of history, okay? That there are gods who are supposed to set the bar on how people should behave. And there are people who follow the gods in doing what, the gods did to do whatever. So the whole thing again is supposed to be this fight between good and evil. Now tell me something, how much of it, of course there are absurd things like, Ravan had an airline or there was a, airport somewhere, etc., etc., etc. So, so where do you draw the line? I mean, how much do you think mythology is history or, history is mythology? So, I mean, let's start from here and go like that. And by the way, Anuja is our columnist, so big hand for her.
Thank you so much, Ravi. Firstly, thank you. I'm so glad that we are sitting in the safest seats right now, right out of the security check. I think there has been a recent trend in kind of freezing mythology as something which is very rigid, that is like a one truth that we have, that we can't deviate from or we can't have a variation of. But I think that has been the fluidity of mythology, that it is different in every state, in every village, in every city. In the south, you have a variation of the Ramayana, where Sita is Ravan's daughter. In the south, you have a variation of the Mahabharata, where Eklavya was ultimately killed by Krishna. Right? I think that's the whole beauty of our mythology, that it is the imagination of our ancestors mixed with the debris of our history and the philosophy of the civilization in which it was written. So when we are dealing with concepts like myths and modernity, that's the entire panel discussion that's about, we look at it as diametrically opposite concepts, but I don't think they are opposite. It's more like the sky and the sea in a water cycle. It evaporates, goes up in the heavens, and comes down and crystallizes down again.
I'm glad you started with this whole debate about history and mythology, because whenever we introduce ourselves as myth authors, the first thing they ask is, "Sab history tha, right? It all happened, right?" So it's kind of becomes the elephant in the room. So I'm glad we're addressing it right at the outset. For me, I think the moment you say that something is history and not mythology, I think you are making a value judgment where you're putting history at a higher pedestal than mythology. And for me, that is, I don't at all agree with that. I think history, first of all, is extremely time-bound. I've always felt that history is about AD and BC. It is about dates. It is about events. It is about a timeline. Mytho is timeless. How do you contain Mahadev and Krishna and Ram within timelines? How do you put them within a date? So for me, that has always been a primary problem. Also, I always feel history has a certain amount of arrogance. I have a huge respect for the discipline, so in case any historians are up in Katgels, but history has a certain amount of arrogance in the sense that history says that I know, because I have the evidence to prove. Mytho says I don't know, but I still believe. I don't have the evidence to prove, but I have faith. So on one hand, you have evidence, on one hand, you have faith. So that, for me, has always been the tussle. So I think, for me, that is really the core of this particular argument, that history is time-bound. History reeks of a certain amount of arrogance. Mytho, for me, is timeless, and mytho does not need evidence, it just needs your faith.
Yeah, but then, which means that you are putting imagination or irrationality above what is
No, it's
really
again,
happening?
there is a difference between faith and superstition. When I say faith, what is it that I'm absorbing? When I talk about, for example, one of the stories in my book is about, the Ganga falling on the head of Shiva and him capturing it. Now, I don't have the evidence to prove it. Did it really happen? But for me, what I take from that is just the sheer, first of all, the sheer spectacular imagery of that moment and the learning that I get from that, if I ever falter in life, there is a greater force that will probably hold me. So if you take what is positive and what really is a learning example, then I think that is what is really that is what really matters.
That's a good answer. What do you think?
I pretty much agree with what both of them, Gaurav and Satyarth, have said so far. To put it in its simplest terms, I would say history is fact-based fiction, and mythology, it's fiction-based fact. So, mythology has a lot of historical elements to it. History does have a lot of mythological elements to it. And in both cases, it all comes down to faith. If you ask a child, do you believe in the tooth fairy? The child is going to believe in the tooth fairy. That's the child's truth. You can't say, no, there's no tooth fairy. Give me scientific evidence, whatever. When you're a child, that's your truth. So if you believe in something, your belief lends it power. So whether it's history or mythology, I would say that he mentioned that, he talked about the time factor. I would say both contain timeless truths, and it's up to you to unearth those timeless truths for yourself, because that's the only thing that matters. The essence of it is what matters. And we tend to get too bogged down with the details, and I think that's the reason why people kill themselves over the stories. At the end of the day, they're all stories. They're important, yes, but they're still stories.
Yeah, that's something which what she's
I can
talking.
slightly disagree with both of them on the concept of faith being a necessary element for appreciating or understanding mythology. I think the moment the word faith comes in, it is something that you have to believe in for it to be true. But the whole beauty of mythology, it's a tale which our ancestors made of their imagination, where of course they mixed in fact and the culture around them to make sense of the things around them. For example, they made a god of lightning and thunder because they could not explain the elements then. That's why we have Indra here, Zeus in the Greek mythology, and Thor in the Norse mythology. But to appreciate the beauty of those tales, we don't have to believe in them. It's a tale, It's a reflection of that civilization and philosophy.
Like splitting hairs, there's a difference between faith and belief, right? Like history that is written history began, I think, 3,200 years ago with the Sumerian civilization. And Indian written history began, I think, in 250 BC. Okay. Now, what you believe in is not necessarily what happened, or it's a version of what has happened. But what intrigues me is, the Greeks. The Greek mythology is one of the most strongest mythologies, as strong as Indian mythology. And they had the same stories of power, lust, beauty, revenge, everything. And they had gods they worshipped. They had their heroes, who died or were exalted, and gods helped them, etc., etc., etc. The Romans had, I think, 10,000 gods like we guys have. The Scandinavian mythology, if you look at it, is so powerful that it gods like Thor, heroes like Siegfried. But the Greeks don't really give a damn today about Zeus or they don't care. Italians are not going around beating their breast about kind of why did Zeus kind of throw thunderbolts and so and so. The the Norwegians or the Scandinavians are pretty relaxed about the fact that somebody can make a movie on Thor and kind of laugh at it. But why are we so worked up about somebody making a movie and because Lord Ram has a mustache? I can't figure this.
I think we are forgetting the importance of history now in this, because the Greeks were conquered by Romans, and ultimately when Christianity came in, they made a concerted effort in destroying all the so-called pagan religions. But India, on the other hand, we are a lot closer to our mythology, as in there's a sacred thread that connects us to the same gods we worship then. Of course, in our ancestry, we worship the pantheon the same way, the elemental pantheons, a god of rain, a god of thunder, a god of wind. And that was superseded by the Trinity, And that is something which we have worshipped continuously, because there has been no, efforts have been made to change that about us, but we have continued that worship. When it comes to every other civilization, they were conquered, assimilated, absorbed, and recycled.
Okay, I got to break in there because I was doing a lot of research on native gods. So when organized Hinduism came into, say, let's talk about Bengal, or when it came into, even tribal areas, places like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, what the Greeks did to the pagan gods, whom they call demons, from where the word demon come in, they did it to the Dravidian gods, where, there is a god called Karinkali, which is a very, very, very Kerala god, which goes back tribally thousands. So that's become that's kind of, enjoined with Kali. So similarly, the same thing has happened in India as well. So whenever organized religions taking over local thing, it's a certain form of mythological colonization. Okay, so you're integrating millions of years of history, oral tradition, by putting it all together under one belief system. So how does it affect your writing? How does it affect your perception about kind of a plot, or how does it kind of work on I mean your interpretation, the feminist interpretation of Abhimanyu, which is I think a very very unusual way of doing it, because what all of you are doing are trying to find unusual aspects about mythology.
Oh, it's as to your question as to why we take all of this so personally. That's how you started. I would say mainly it's because we had an oral tradition of storytelling which thrives to this very day. We didn't have before. You mentioned that written history started much later. So with the oral tradition, you have to make more of an effort to absorb these stories into your blood and bones. So I think it's there for all of us to go after these stories, put some effort into keeping it alive. And Gaurav had mentioned how that with the other religions, they were absorbed, assimilated and recycled. I think a little of that happened, but not entirely. Because if you take the Vedic gods, Indra was Zeus. The way Zeus was held to be the king of the gods, Indra was given a lot of prominence, and the Trinity as we know them today, Brahma, Shiva, Vishnu, they came much later, post-Vedic. So, there was a degree of recycling which happened, a lot of absorption, assimilation. In fact, we say that even Buddha, even Jesus, they are incarnations of Vishnu. So that's how Hinduism has been. We didn't even call it Hinduism originally. That itself is a very modern term. And for me personally, when I'm writing, how I factor this in is it's like I'm trying to make sense of a legacy which has been handed down to me. I've never been the sort to accept things blindly. In fact, I used to irritate my mother, grandmother by questioning all the stories I've been told. I'll say, why the hell did Rama ask Sita to prove herself? He should prove himself if he wants. Why should she prove anything? And they'll all say, you're questioning Lord Rama. So I never had that degree of reverence. I was always irreverent. So for me, I love the stories, but I also have to make sense of them from where I stand. So in India, if you notice, growing up as a girl is very different. Boys have all the fun. So as a child, I think I used to have a bad case of penis envy. I wanted to be a boy. It was like this exclusive club, and I was denied membership. So I had to make sense of a world where I felt that women were being oppressed. And, so when I examine these stories, I find women of power and strength. And these are the stories I want to say. I do not want to use this legacy which has been handed down to us as I don't want this to be used as an excuse to enslave women. For me, it's about empowerment. So that's what my story is.
It's interesting that she talks about Ram. What is fascinating when I entered the world of the Purans, what was extremely fascinating was just how gray that entire world was. We talk about 50 shades of gray. Our Puranas have 5 million shades of gray. Yeah. It is amazing, that world. So there's a story there where, so this Brahman comes to the court of Ram and he says, you have killed my son. And Ram says, how's that possible? I can never do something like that. And he said, today morning, my son just collapsed dead. And Ram said, but then obviously I was not responsible. He said, you are, because if something so unnatural happens in a kingdom, and that time the belief was that the seed would have been with the king. The king would have done something wrong. It trickles down to the lowest common denominator. So then so you have actually failed to do something right. So investigations happened, and then they found out that there was a Shudra called Shambhuka who was reciting scriptures. And in the Treta Yuga, the Shudra class was barred from reading the scriptures. So that became the root cause. Because that is being done, that is affecting the entire society. So Ram goes, and there's a whole discussion that he and Shambhuka have. Now Shambhuka says, I want to go to heaven physically with my body, and so I'm chanting the Vedas. Ram says, you are creating all sorts of distress in my kingdom. I forbid you to do that. There's a discussion, and then ultimately Ram beheads Shambhuka. So now there are two ways of looking at that story. One, of course, that Ram being the king, and he is the repository of the values and the ethics. And of course, for him, the security of his kingdom is the primary concern. So he's justified. On the other hand, this can also be seen as an example of caste oppression, where you have one caste oppressing the low caste from reading what was supposed to be higher literature. So that is what the Puranas do, and you have enough to say on both the sides. So on which side do you stand? That is what the Puranas, every story that I've written in my book, every story ends with a question, with a moral dilemma.
No, that's a fantastic interpretation, because you're actually choosing the writer to make a stand. Right? And where does this, I mean, what does it give you? What satisfaction does it give you? So which means that you have to make the writer choose.
Exactly,
right?
which is why when people say, why don't you have a lesson at the end of every story? I said, I want my readers to engage. They should engage. It should be their own cerebral process where they go through a story and then they decide for themselves on which side of the fence are you on. That is what is mentally so more, cerebrally much more fantastic.
Gaurav, your take.
So I think now I'm just using retelling just to completely say something different, to bring about very hidden aspects of history and combine with mythology. And since we're in Odisha, let me talk a little bit about Odisha. Odisha is just mostly remembered for the one time we lost to Ashoka. Okay, that stupid movie of Shah Rukh Khan also spoke about that. But no one remembers that Kharavela went and took revenge and ultimately brought down the Mauryan Empire. Right? And in a sense, Odisha's rich naval history was so much that Odisha, when it was Kalinga, technically colonized Southeast Asia. You know, we have a festival that is running for centuries called Bali Jatra, which celebrates how our sailors, called sadhakas, used to take swan ships and called boitas, and go, and bring riches from the Golden Islands, which were the Sumatra, Javan Islands. Now, in Mahabharata, there is just one line, that Duryodhan was married to Bhanumati, a princess of a powerful naval kingdom, Kalinga. That's it, one line. Right? So, like, for example, so I was like, 1 second, this is my chance, to do something, to show Kalinga's history. Because now if I'm speaking like this in a history lesson, the knowledge retention is less. When it is shown in a Bollywood movie or through a book, it stays with you. So that's why I created this pirate princess character around Mati, but using that to show Kalinga. And this is where history and mythology always mix. Because that is the whole idea of retelling, There's a reason why we don't call it a variation, but a retelling, because our mythology itself allows for this to happen. And I'll just give you one story, like Satyarth gave. And I know we're running short on time, but there's a beautiful story where Hanuman was not letting Prince Ram die. Okay, so what Ram does is he slips his ring, which falls to the cracks of the earth, to the Patal Lok. Okay, and when Hanuman goes there to find it, he sees there's an entire mountain of rings. And the person tells that there's an entire multiverse of madness, because Ramayana is cyclical and has taken place over 1,000 times with slightly different outcome each time.
Amazing.
And in fact, this is even connected to the Hindu custom of feeding crows after someone passes away. We feed crows in the 11th day or something on those lines. Why is that done? Because the crow is a symbolic representation of Kak Bhushundi, who was a sage who was cursed to be a crow who exists outside space and time. So he could travel past, present, and future, and he has seen the Mahabharata 16 times and the Ramayana 21 times with each a different outcome.
Yeah.
So when we feed him, he takes our food, the food which we feed him, to our ancestors who are existing outside space and time till they undergo the cycle of rebirth.
Yeah, since now we're short of time, I think we have time for like 2 more questions. And I think, Anuj, I'm leaving out of this particular question because of, if I'm not wrong, both of you there was an aspect of the Mauryan Empire in both your books, So in your book on Porus, as far as I read about in history, Porus he defeats the Seleucus, and then they kind of then he is assassinated, of course. I mean, in your book, and who you are, I'm a bit afraid of asking questions because I read somewhere that he also knows fighting with sword. So, I shall kind of keep it a bit kind of polite on you.
I think you should be more scared that I'm a lawyer.
No. You can sue yourself, so that's okay. But in your case, when you did your book, how did both of you handle research? Because I found it so difficult to find any evidence except a little bit of, architectural evidence of streets, and there's very little written evidence, and even, archaeological evidence. How did you guys kind of figure that?
For me as an author, that was my whole task of world building, where I wanted to create an immersive. Because the thing is, every projection of ancient India imagines Ram coming out from a hut, they don't depict the forts and palaces of Rajasthan, like how intricately they are constructed. If anyone has taken a tour of Rajasthan, they see that our architecture is way beyond European castles and forts. But when you look at any ancient Indian imagination, due to production value, they both stand on each side of the battlefield and shoot arrows at each other. But if you actually read the Mahabharata, at one of the Mahabharatas, let's say Sri Rajagopalachari.
Let's speak to Porus. Let's speak to the Magadhan Empire. Let's
Magadhan
speak
Empire.
to the Magadha
Sure.
premise. That's what I want to know compared between both of you.
So that's where there are these gaps where our job as an author comes in. We're creating a world, we're reimagining it as what we think, where we are playing God or rather Thanos, where we click our thumbs and reimagine it as we see it. God created world in its own image, that's what the Bible says, and author creates the world in his book in his own image, what he wants to see. So that's what
See,
I do.
recorded evidence very little exists, which says that Chandragupta built his palaces and buildings in stone, while Ashoka turned it into wood because he loved the smell of sandalwood. So when that burned down, that is one of the reasons why very little remains. So when in your situation, how did you do the research? I mean, he's told me what.
Right. See, I didn't write a book on Porus. I scripted a television show on Sony, which was about Porus and Alexander. So, and like you completely and rightly pointed out, there was absolutely no material. So the entire Porus part was pure fiction. That was entirely world building on our part. We created all the characters, the storyline, and everything, which is so ironical because the only thing we know about Porus in our history is that he stood up against Alexander and said that very famous line that treat me as you would treat a king. While there are reams and books and materials on Alexander on that side of the globe, here we talk about Porus as probably the first great Hindu king, and there's hardly any literature on him. Right. So I think it's ironical, but like I said, we had to create that entire aspect of it.
So maybe did Porus exist at all?
Sorry?
Did Porus exist at all, considering the amount of kind of literary evidence available, historical evidence, even about that, I forget the guy's name, that, not Thanos, who was it, that monk who accompanied Alexander, who was supposed to be in a plant in Alexander's camp. So there is so much of
Herodotus wrote about. He didn't travel with him, but he wrote about that.
Canos.
I have not written about
Canos.
Porus,
His name
by the
was
way.
Canos. So like what I want to ask you is that you have interpreted different points of view in myth. Okay, I mean there's a totally different take, a feminine take on the relationship between the mother and the son, Abhimanyu, the mother's darling, but the brave warrior at the same time, who's kind, who's compassionate, and actually is a victim of his own thing, which is very different from what is portrayed in the Mahabharata. So, how valid? I'm not talking about opinion. I'm talking about how valid do you think it is to communicate another point of view which goes against the established or the established narrative? Would you find a conflict within from your audience?
Actually, I think the most provocative, controversial take of it would be returning to the roots of the epic. Because if you take Valmiki's Ramayana, there's actually an orgy scene in Lanka, in Ravana's palace, because that was the Rakshasa way of life, and Valmiki portrayed it that way, in the interests of authenticity. He showed that the Rakshasas were sexually experimental, liberated, progressive, what you want to call it. And later when Tulsi wrote it from a bhakti point of view, he kind of sanitizes those parts. And it's the same with Tamil in Kamba Ramayana, because again, it's a more conservative take on the Ramayana. But if you return to the roots, you find that it's sexually very, very suggestive. It's the same in the Mahabharata, and if you take a character like Abhimanyu, if you're looking at the story through his eyes, you're returning to the roots actually. Even there, if you take the lineage of the Pandavas, they belong to the lunar dynasty, the Chandravamsa. So if you take the ancestors of the Pandavas, you have a character, they are descendants of the moon god, Chandra, right? So Chandra had an affair with Tara, who was Brihaspati's wife, and the child born of their love out of wedlock.
Pretty complicated.
That was Buddha. That was Buddha. And Buddha, when Brihaspati claimed parentage, he said, this is my wife, so anything, her womb is my property. And Tara says, I beg to differ. This is Chandra's son. I may have been forced to return to you, but the truth is, this is Chandra's son. And then they asked the baby, who's your father? And he says it's Chandra. So this child was cursed by Brihaspati and he was gender fluid. He wasn't a man or a woman.
LGBTQ.
Gender, exactly. LGBTQIA+. So this guy is like gender fluid. And then you have Ila, another ancestor of the Pandavas who was Buddha, and he was destined to be a man for 6 months a year, a woman for 6 months a year.
Sounds like Arjun also, no?
Arjuna was a eunuch. So Abhimanyu does come from this high. So that's what I'm saying. I didn't make up anything. It's not a radical departure from the Mahabharata. And yet a lot of people would find it shocking. This is what I talked about when I said you return to the roots. You leave away human agenda which came across. I'm not saying I'm without an agenda. I mentioned that my perspective is largely feminist. But I try to keep even myself out of the way. Just get to the heart of it.
A simplification of mythology to kind of, make things effective. Anyway, I think we've got 5 minutes. Do any of you have any questions from our eminent guests? What a pity. Aren't you guys interested in mythology at all?
Just, I don't mean any offense. I'm asking you three authors. Do you know Sanskrit? None
No.
of you? Okay. So now, before alluding to a mythology, when you are crafting your fiction, which adaptation, how will you know that something that you are falling back on as the source text is authentic?
Ma'am, when you say authentic, right, you're assuming that there is one original one. So when C. Rajagopalacharya, which is the most famous version of the Mahabharata, which came out around 1960s, that's the most popular one. That does not make it the most original one. Ma'am, do you know this whole concept of Lakshman Rekha in Ramayana, which is obviously something which we associate with Ramayana, right? Ma'am, do you know that is not there in Valmiki's Ramayana? It came in the Bengali version of Ramayana in the 1910s, where he created this fiction that Lakshman drew this rekha around it. But it has permeated so much into our ethos and conscience that we now treat it as absolutely unviolable. Right? So I think that's where, ma'am, when you asked that which version did I refer to personally when I was researching on this reimagination of Mahabharata, I looked at least 7 versions, one in Southeast Asia, all of them English translations, ma'am. And yes, when I don't know Sanskrit, you can say that is something lost in translation. But then again, the original Mahabharata, if you can call it that, there are Tamilian Sanskrit versions as well, which a lot of people claim original, which people who do not know Tamilian Sanskrit might not know. So that is the entire beauty of our mythology, that since, because of the Indian subcontinent, there are so many different variations that you can't, I personally think that we can't make a claim that, okay, since I don't know Sanskrit, since I haven't read this one original, I am not eligible to.
No, because I am reading Ramayana now in original.
Okay.
I don't know
Which original, ma'am?
I don't know Sanskrit, but Sanskrit and then Odia.
But which
that
original?
Translation.
May I interject here? You know, you're
Valmiki.
talking about language, but you will be surprised to know that the Puranas themselves, what we have, even if you go to the Sanskrit texts that are available, they are not the original Puranas. The Puranas have been drafted and redrafted over thousands of centuries. What might have come as a Akashvani to the saints, which is what the Puranas are supposed to have come down to, those were then over the years constantly drafted and redrafted by many scholars. So what you ultimately end up with, that's not at all the purest form. I think the search for purity is extremely futile because the kind of history we have. No, it is because. Yes, but that's one version of the Ramayana. There is a Tulsidas Ramayana as well. So you cannot have, there is no one seminal text in India. And that is what is the beauty of our culture, that we celebrate plurality. You know, there are 36 Purans, 18 Mahapurans and 18 Upapurans. In every Puran, you have a different version of the same story. In every Puran. And the Puranas celebrate that. We have always been a culture that celebrates plurality and celebrates a heterogeneity of voices. So today, when of course we are being told in the country that there is one great Hindu narrative, I'm sorry, that's not the truth. The Puranas don't celebrate that. It is, let's start celebrating our plurality. That is what is more important. There is no one great truth.
And logically that makes sense because the way our Puranas were transmitted were orally. You know, the oral tradition. There was bound to be some slippage. You know? No, ma'am, but you said right now Valmiki's
Everything is a story. They're
the
all
original
stories.
Ramayana. The Valmiki's Ramayana is the original Ramayana. Ma'am, that is something which, as Satyarth correctly pointed out, there are so many variations of the Valmiki's Ramayana. the one which you are reading as Valmiki's Ramayana may not be the Valmiki's Ramayana read by the South. No, ma'am, that is true.
No, this is what we were talking about, the conflict.
You know,
between
Javed
faith
Akhtar,
and
I
belief.
think, has a wonderful answer for this. He always gives this example कि लोग जो purity की बात करते हैं, तो it's like you start peeling an onion to look कि purity कहाँ है. Purity onion वो छिलके में ही purity है. If you keep peeling everything out, you'll be left with nothing. So, you know.